Kia ora and good evening. Welcome to another night of local news brought to you by CITV and Waterline. I'm Vincent Peters. First, here's stories from your community. Cook Islanders can be confident that each and every one of us, as well as the future generation, will benefit from any sort of deep sea mining activity that takes place here. This guarantee will be in the form of a framework which is to be drafted by a team from the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, who are currently meeting with government.
The framework would consist of a national policy to govern deep seabed mining activity and also legislation. And within that legislation there would be provisions that would deal with environmental impact assessment, monitoring and compliance based on best international practices.
Putting in place a framework before handing out licenses will ensure that the country does not lose out on any potential benefits.
The former experience throughout dozens of countries, it is extremely important to set the proper framework, to put the proper framework in place prior to undertake any negotiation or giving any licenses to some companies. And this involved, in the first phase, developing the policy, which we've told the government yesterday we're trying to achieve before the end of the year. After that, we'll finalize the legislation and put in place the appropriate set of licenses to make sure that this development this is something which is for many years to come, for the next 50 years or 70 years. So you need to have the proper framework, whether it's a legal regime, or the fiscal regime in place before any activity is undertaken.
Many countries who have fast-tracked their mining activities without putting in place a proper framework have suffered from revenue mismanagement and corruption. This can be seen all around the world, where countries who have the most natural resources are also some of the poorest.
Past 50 years, if there's one thing that was not done properly in many countries, was the management of natural resources revenue. Mining revenues, but even more for petroleum revenues. And you have an enormous number of countries that actually discovered oil, for instance, 25 years ago, and actually poorer today than they were before they discovered oil. And one of the reasons is that the petroleum revenues were not properly collected, they were not properly managed, and in some ways they got lost in the system. So if you're trying to account for some of these revenue today, you don't know where the money has gone.
The framework will also address another major concern, that is the impact of mining activity will have on the environment.
Obviously, within the overall legislation, in this case particularly the environmental legislation, there's 3 or 4 aspects of it that will have to be covered. One of it is waste disposal at sea. And depending on the technology used, if some of the treatment on the nodules is done at sea, on the boat itself, on the motorboat, the environmental legislation will have to cover some aspect for waste disposal at sea. But not only that, it will have to also cover, obviously, potential environmental contaminant, whether they're biological or chemical. And then the regular, I would say, a type of environmental legislation covering protection of flora and fauna. And this also depends whether or not the processing itself of the mineral is done on the island, in Cook Islands or somewhere else.
The Cook Islands is estimated to be sitting on billions of dollars of manganese nodules. Ensuring that this revenue benefits future generation of Cook Islanders is one of the guiding forces of the framework.
And the objective is really to have a system which will be attractive for companies to come in and develop these deep sea minerals, but at the same time to optimize the revenue, the benefits that the government of Cook Islands would receive and the population of Cook Islands would receive, but not only for this current generation, but also with the future. And one of the aspects we've been working on in a number of countries is the question of revenue management. Because if there's a substantial additional revenues coming from this mining activity, the government of Cook Island will probably need some assistance in terms of develop the mechanism to make sure that all these revenues are collected from the companies, they're managed, and also how they're transferred to the government budget. Because I think the important principle, and I think it's the view of the government, is that these nodules or these resources is not only the property of the current generation, but also the property of the future generation of Cook Island. So it's important to keep to have a system in place to make sure that it's not only something that will last 30 or 40 years, but will ensure benefits for in a sustainable way for the future generations.
Cook Islanders have received mixed statements on whether the nodules actually mineable, given that they sit some 5 miles below the sea surface.
I mean, companies have been investing a lot of money in the past 10 years to develop technologies in order to do that. Today there's maybe 3 or 4 types of different technologies that are being looked at. In the case of mineral, it's always a question of, it's not a question of feasibility per se, but it's more a question of commercial viability. And in the past few years, obviously, cost of the value, the price of mineral, of all commodities have been increasing tremendously. And especially for some of the mineral that you can find in these nodules, especially cobalt, which is now like 5 times the price as it was like 5 or 10 years ago.
According to Associate Finance Minister Teripai Moate Jr., they have had requested the Commonwealth Secretariat assist the Cook Islands, as the expertise do not exist here.
Probably recall we brought the World Bank to represent, and I'm talking on behalf of the committee. And because we've been underestimated, we underestimated ourselves as a new area to venture in. And being attacked from the public, you've seen the medias, and in fact it was you that put all this information in the paper and against. But the reality is, we in the Cook Islands do not have the capacity, and no one can tell us. They know everything about it. So with these guys come on board, it's purely to for us as the government of the day to be careful of how we proceed with this project. Even though we're keen to see the revenue out of the whole project, but at the end of the day, as mentioned by Daniel, it's our people's revenue for the future.
Duo are also working on another submission for the extension of Cook Islands' continental shelf. This will enable the Cook Islands to lay claim to the natural resources outside our current boundaries.
Only about nodules. The extension of the continental shelf would allow the government to secure exclusive access to all natural and living resources on the seabed in that area. So that includes potentially oil, gas, petroleum, deep seabed mineral resources, including polymetallic nodules, but also living marine resources that live on the seabed, including genetic resources.
This submission will be presented to the United Nations Commission on Limits on the Continental Shelf, who will consider the document and then make recommendations to the government. The Cook Islands currently has a good chance of extending its continental shelf limits to the northwest direction.
The northwest.
Northwest.
A significant area, in the order of 300,000 square kilometres.
That's a lot.
It's a significant area, yes. It's the largest single area that we know could be claimed by any Pacific Island country at this stage.
Usually, countries making claims have to make concessions for claims by neighbouring countries.
Fortunately, the Cook Islands is in a good position on that sense, because the extension of the continental shelf will not impinge upon any areas that could be extended by any other countries in the region.
The deadline for this submission is May 2009. Both experts have been quite impressed with the amount of commitment already given to both the mining and the continental shelf areas. The experts have been funded under a Commonwealth Secretariat and technical funding arrangement. They depart later this week. I'm Vincent Peters for tonight's CITC and What Local News. We'll be right back with more local news after this commercial break.